Hi, it's Penny here, and today I'm going to be wrapping up all the books that I read in the month of February. So I read 11 things, and as usual, I'm going to do this book battle style, which means I pair all the books up and battle them against each other until we come up with the best book of the month. So our first battle is going to be between a couple of post-apocalyptic sci-fi books. We have Nona the Ninth by Tamsyn Muir up against The Fall of Koli by M.R. Carey, and actually both of these books are third books in the series, although Nona the Ninth is not the end of the series, although it's the last one published so far. So this is the third book in the Locked Tomb series that started with Gideon the Ninth. The best way to describe this is necromancers in space, but super weird. So in the first book, we basically start out with Gideon the Ninth. She comes from the ninth house, which is very gothic and depressing, and she's always wanted to escape. So she makes a deal with the head of the house that they will go together to this like competition, necromancy competition thing, and Gideon's going to act as security. It kind of turns into a bit of a murder mystery, but there's a lot more going on. The second book, Harrow, is super weird and you never really know what's going on. So it's not surprising when Nona starts out also really weird and you don't really know what's going on, although I think you do know more about what's going on in Nona than you do in Harrow. Harrow, you really start doubting whether things are real, and maybe there's a little bit of that in Nona, but Nona is a little bit more grounded. Basically, we have Nona, who is a character we haven't met in the previous two books, although we can see the links because she is being kind of cared for by some other characters that we do know. And Nona is very childlike in her behavior. It's clear that maybe she's a little bit older, and I think right from the beginning you will have some guesses about who she might really be if you've read the other books in the series. But Nona doesn't know who she is, and the people around her don't know, even though they might also have some guesses. But Nona is just living her life. The world that they live in feels a little bit like war-torn, and there's definitely still this like necromancy, sci-fi aspect to things. But really, Nona just wants to do her job at this local school where she helps out as a teaching assistant, although mainly she just looks after one of the teacher's dogs and like hangs out with the children. And like just Nona's whole experience is very basic, functional living stuff, like the kind of stuff that children do care about. But you can see the bigger story going on around her. And so even though Nona doesn't understand a lot of what's going on around her, you as the reader have the context that you understand what's going on around her. Well, no, you still won't understand, but you understand more than Nona. And the way that the story unfolds is kind of crazy. I especially loved all the New Zealand references in this because Tamsyn Muir is a New Zealand author. I'm trying to point at the name, but it's up here. Tamsyn Muir is a New Zealand author, and I'm also from New Zealand, and I just think the New Zealand references in this were amazing. There's also a whole section in this which is kind of the backstory of the world, and that especially has a lot of New Zealand references that I loved. Like, I think if you like weird sci-fi and you're from New Zealand and you haven't read this, you really need to sort that out. I wish I had read this earlier, although I'm kind of glad I didn't because we are still waiting for the fourth book and there's no word on when that's coming. But I'm also really happy for Tamsyn Muir to take as long as she wants to write that, because I feel like she set herself a really hard challenge for this fourth book just because the first three are so different from anything else I've ever read. So I wanted to take her time and do it well. Also, I love this series. I love Nona. It was amazing. So then, the other book in this battle is The Fall of Koli. So this is the third and final book in the Rampart trilogy. So in this, the world is basically one that has been taken over by trees. So trees are now a lot more alive, and if they hear you walking around them, or if you build your house out of them and you don't make sure that they're properly dead, they might attack you and eat you. Like, it's a very dangerous world, and as a result humanity is now living in these quite isolated villages, but they do have a few pieces of remaining tech. I I think my favorite part of this whole series is how much the people of this world misunderstand the technology that they have. And so there is also an AI element to some of this technology, and in the third book that really has become a significant part of the plot. And as is often the case for me in these kind of books, the AI characters were my most favorite characters. So basically we're following this young boy named Koli, and in the first book he is being tested to see if the technology will wait for him, because that's kind of the typical thing that happens to young people in this world. And if the technology will wait for them, they kind of gain a position of power and are able to use some of this remaining tech. So during the series, we're mainly following along with Koli as he learns more about the technology and understands more about the world. This third book was not necessarily what I was expecting, but I did really like it. There were some really intense scenes, like emotionally devastating, but sometimes also very action-packed. There was some really creepy parts in the beginning that I really loved. And then kind of everything came together in such a triumphant way, even though there were also some massive disasters that the characters had to deal with. And like, as I said, it didn't go where I expected, but I really liked it. I think if you have read the previous books in this series and you enjoyed them, you'll still enjoy this last one. It was a very satisfying end to the series. So if I'm battling these two books up against each other, it's really difficult because I love them both. But I think I do have to pick Nona just because it was so unique and different from anything I've ever read. Which feels unfair because that's probably somewhat true for The Fall of Koli as well. But still, maybe for the New Zealand references, I have to pick Nona, so that'll go through to the next round. Then our next battle is going to be an N.K. Jemisin round because I have The Killing Moon by N.K. Jemisin up against The 100,000 Kingdoms by N.K. Jemisin. So both of these are actually first books in series to contrast with the last battle. So The Killing Moon is a series where in this particular city we have this priesthood that worships this like dream moon goddess, and when people are ready to die, or when the priesthood judges people as too corrupt and dangerous, these priests will go in and basically gather people. They will take their dream blood, which can then be used to like heal people or do other magic, and they'll essentially kill these people to do that. But it's supposed to be sending them on to a better afterlife. However, things happen kind of at the beginning of the book which cause one of these priests to really question whether there's some level of corruption within the religious organization. We're also following his mentee, who's an apprentice priest. I'm now forgetting, was there another name for it? I think so, but I've forgotten. We're also following this woman from another kind of neighboring city. Initially you think she's a prostitute, but she is actually a spy, and they all start working together to try and understand this corruption that's going on. So there were definitely some really interesting ideas in this book. It does take a while to really understand what's going on, and there were also some kind of like romantic, I hesitate to call it romance because I didn't think it was very romantic, but kind of some like weird mentions of attraction between the different characters that just felt quite out of nowhere and unnecessary, and I think took away from kind of the more serious themes of the book, because there was quite a lot of talk about religious corruption and corruption of power, as well as like the morality of ending people's lives and when it might be okay to do that, what kind of consent you might need. So there were some interesting ideas, and for that reason I did enjoy this, but I also wish it had been written somehow a bit better, a bit clearer, or in a way where the characters felt a little bit more real to me. But still, I did enjoy it. Then the other book I read by N.K. Jemisin is The 100,000 Kingdoms. So in this one we also have gods, but there's kind of a history to the world where there used to be 3 main gods. Then one of them killed another one and enslaved the third one, and then kind of chose this ruling family to now have power over that third enslaved god. We're following this young woman who was kind of raised away from the capital, away from any of this nonsense, but then when her mother dies, her grandfather pulls her back and says she's now going to be the heir, even though he already has 2 other heirs, and she's like, doesn't it seem like I'm a bit surplus to requirements? But there's more going on. there's a reason why he's picked her as an heir. And she kind of becomes involved a little bit in this power play struggle between herself and the other heirs. That's not really what the story is about, even though that is part of what's happening. And to be honest, I struggle to really think what this book is about. There's a weird romance between the main character and another character. Spoilers to say who, but it felt like it just came out of nowhere, similar to The Killing Moon, actually. Like, the romance just came out of nowhere. It was really cringe, in my opinion. Maybe for people who like more romantasy, it wouldn't be so bad, but I didn't really like it. And I just didn't feel like a main character ever felt like a real person. Often, the other characters in the book would make observations about what she was like, and I wouldn't have really seen any of those things in her behavior or in her thoughts, which we were getting. So I think that kind of held me back from feeling connected to this, which is frustrating because I really loved the story and what was going on with the gods and kind of how that was slowly revealed. The ending of this was also a little bit confusing, and I just think it could have maybe been tidied up a bit to be a bit clearer. So we'll see. I am going to continue both these series by N.K. Jemisin. The Killing Moon is only duology, so I don't really know where that series is going to go next, but I'll see. And then this one, the next book, is actually going to follow a completely different character, which I'm very hopeful for in terms of hoping to get a character who feels a little bit more real than this one. So we'll see. If I am putting these two books up against each other, I actually think I'm gonna pick The Killing Moon. I think the characters just felt a little bit more real. Some of the themes were a little bit better dealt with. The plot was a bit more complex, but also kind of better explained. Even though I did say it was confusing, I still think it was a little bit better. So I'm going to put Killing Moon through to the next round. Okay, then, even though I just complained about the romances in those two books, the next battle is going to be a romance battle. So we have The Promise by Danielle Steele up against Steele's Edge by Ilona Andrews. So firstly, The Promise. I only picked this up because of nostalgia. Basically, when I was young, I'm pretty sure younger than 10, my stepmom owned this book and I remembered reading it, and for a long time I always wondered about that book that I remembered reading and I couldn't remember what it was. And then finally I found this copy in a little free library and I thought, this is the book. So I wanted to read it to see if it was what I remembered. And it is, although it actually turns out that this is based on a movie, which is weird. But basically what happens is we have these two young people who are very in love, supposedly. I didn't necessarily see it. I hated the way that he had to describe her as better than all the other girls to talk about how much he loved her. But anyway, supposedly very in love, they want to marry. However, he's very rich and she is not. She's an artist and his mother doesn't approve. So he goes to ask his mother, can I marry her? And the mother says, no. So then they decide to drive off and get married, but there's a car crash and then the mother tells him that she's dead and tells her that he will have his life ruined by her if he has to be dragged down by her, having had her whole face scraped off in this car accident. But the mother says, if you promise to leave him alone and not ruin his life, then I will pay for your plastic surgery, you'll get the best care. So really that's your only hope for the future. So she takes the deal and she gets plastic surgery and she looks completely different. And she, in the middle, is all like, what if I changed my name and I practiced walking different and talking different and became a whole new person? So that then when they meet up again later, of course, he doesn't recognize her, but they end up falling in love again. To be honest, most of the middle of this book was them having toxic relationships with other people. And also, the plot made no sense. There were so many opportunities for him to find out that she was not dead. Just at a very basic level, she has no family because she was raised in an orphanage. And the only friends they have are mutual friends. So wouldn't there be a funeral? Wouldn't he find out by the lack of a funeral that maybe she's not dead? So the whole thing didn't really make any sense. And then because they spend so much time in toxic relationships apart, and like he especially is a complete asshole to this other woman, so I didn't even want him to get back together with her. And then like it's only like the last 2 chapters that they finally realize what's going on, and then suddenly they're like, oh, okay, we love each other again. Honestly, from a nostalgia point of view, this was everything I remembered, and it was very satisfying to read. But from a romance book point of view, terrible. Then a much better romance was Steel's Edge by Ilona Andrews. So I love Ilona Andrews. I knew I could rely on them to write like a paranormal romance type book that I would enjoy. This is also the 4th book in a quartet, the Edge novels. So basically each book in this series follows a different romantic pairing, but in this world where we have the broken, which is our world where there's no magic, and we also have the weird where there's lots of magic, and then in between we have the edge that only certain people can go into, like some people from the weird have too much magic to go there, and some people from the broken obviously don't have enough magic, but some people live in the edge even though it's for certain reasons a difficult place to live. In this final book we are following this healer from the weird, and she's very powerful, but due to her ex-husband, or her husband at the time, being a complete asshole, she is tempted to use her healing powers in a negative way, and so to get away from that temptation she moves to the edge, where she runs into this guy who happens to be part of the family from some of the other characters we know from the previous books, and they kind of end up working together to try and take down this like organization of slavers. I really liked especially the first half. I liked them meeting each other. I thought that was really well done, and there were some really brutal and emotional moments. Then the second half, they kind of have this bigger, more complicated plan, and I never was quite sure about how that plan was really going to work, but I was willing to like overlook it, let it make sense, even if it didn't really, because I was enjoying the characters' stories. As well, there are some like younger teenagers that have kind of been involved in all the books in this series, and the way that their story was continuing was very satisfying. There's also kind of like a bigger fantastical thing going on throughout this series that I was very surprised they managed to wrap up at the very end of this book. So this was another very satisfying end to a series, and I had a really great time with it. I think it's pretty obvious if I put this up against The Promise that obviously I'm going to pick Steel's Edge. Okay, then the next battle we have Januaries by Olivie Blake up against The Silence Factory by Bridget Collins. So Januaries is a short story anthology by Olivie Blake. I have liked some stuff by Olivie Blake before. I will admit sometimes I struggle with her execution a little bit, but I do often like her ideas. So for that reason, I picked up Januaries. The idea is really that there is like 3 short stories for each season. So what I realized after the fact is that I probably should have read this over a year and just read 1 short story every month and maybe tried to align it with the seasons. But I didn't do that. I tried to read 1 every time I went for a run because I was listening to this on an audiobook. And I actually started this in January when I was reading too many things, and I'd planned to finish in January. I thought reading Januaries in January would make sense, but now I don't think it did. I just think I'd been reading too many short stories, which hindered my enjoyment of this, because I did really like some of these stories, but I wish I had had a little bit more time with them, and reading them kind of quite close together I think almost made them blur together a little bit, because Olivie Blake does write some of her characters in very similar ways and often deals with very similar themes throughout a lot of these stories, which isn't necessarily a bad thing for a short story anthology, right? It just, I don't think the way I read it was optimal. So I am actually thinking about rereading this at some point in a better way. Maybe starting in spring, because I think the book starts in spring. I have also learnt that the physical copy has pictures, and I'm feeling FOMO about not having gotten to see the pictures as I was reading the book. Anyway, I don't really know, because it's a short story anthology, there's no point giving you the plots of any of the stories. There's some kind of weird ones. A lot of them do have some kind of supernatural element and some kind of toxic romance. I did also actually realize after the fact that Olivie Blake was one of the audiobook narrators, and I immediately, as soon as I found that out, knew which one, because like all the stories are narrated by different audiobook narrators, although I think most of them do like 2 or 3 stories each, kind of like rotating through the book. But there was one audiobook narrator, and every time I would think, wow, you were narrating this and just like hitting the lines in the exact way that I would imagine Olivie Blake saying them, because she has a YouTube channel, so I have heard her talk. And so then realizing that it was actually Olivie Blake made a lot of sense, right? Anyway, the summary of this is that I think they were really well done short stories. I just didn't read it in an optimal way. So then the other book in this battle is The Silence Factory. I mainly picked this up because I loved The Betrayals by Bridget Collins, and ever since I've read it, every book I've picked up by Bridget Collins, I've been hoping it would give me the same feeling. The Binding by Bridget Collins, the first half did, the second half no, and The Silence Factory just absolutely no, didn't give me what I was looking for at all. So primarily we're following 2 characters. One of them is this man whose wife has died, so he's trying to find a new life, and he ends up getting involved with this spider silk salesman. So there's this particular silk that they're making, and one side of it will give you a complete sense of silence. The other side maybe has some problems. And so this man has started getting involved kind of in the marketing of this silk. Then as well, we're getting the diary of this silk maker's like great aunt or something when they were first discovering the silk, or discovering the spiders that make this silk. And she has a very toxic relationship with her husband. Like, she really wants to be a great wife and have a child and a family with him, but he's like obsessed with these spiders and making money, and he's kind of an asshole. So it was hard to be emotionally engaged with this woman when all her thoughts are about trying to please this man who doesn't deserve being pleased. And then also, in the future timeline, this man who's getting involved in the marketing is kind of like forming a crush or something on this man who's the businessman for the spider silk. And he is also clearly a terrible person. So again, very hard to become emotionally engaged in what he's trying to achieve when it's clearly a bad idea. As well, like, it did do some interesting things with the spider silk, but not till quite near the end. There was just a lot of this book when not much was really happening, and it never emotionally pulled me in like The Betrayals did. So disappointing. And I just don't know if I should bother picking up anything by Bridget Collins in the future. I don't think I'm ever going to recreate that feeling I got from The Betrayals. So if I'm battling these 2 books up against each other, I think it's pretty obvious we are going to pick Januaries to go through to the next round. And then the last battle. I think the only way I can tie these books together is that they're all a little bit about the horrors of the world. So we have What White People Can Do Next by Emma Dabiri up against Sour Candy by Kealan Patrick Burke, up against Monstress Volume 9, The Possessed by Marjorie and Sana Takeda. Okay, so What White People Can Do Next. This is basically just about racism in the world. I really liked the perspective of it. I think it's very different from a lot of what you hear, especially coming out of America. And I think it was written in a way that really encourages reflection and like deep thinking. I also think it did a really good job of balancing, calling out the fact that the whole concept of race is bullshit, while also like seriously addressing the impacts of that concept. And it did the whole thing so concisely, because this is a pretty short audiobook, and I would definitely recommend it if, I was going to say if this topic interests you, but actually, regardless, even if it doesn't interest you, I would recommend this. Then we have Sour Candy. So this is like a short horror novella. We're following this guy who goes to buy candy for his girlfriend at the store, and when he's there, there's this kid crying, and everything kind of goes wrong for him from there. I didn't mind this. I had heard a lot of people rave about this, and I don't really get it. I thought it was fine, but I wasn't like massively engaged in it. I didn't find any of the twists blew me away. And the main thing that I remember about this is right near the end, there was a little like half line referencing like domestic abuse in an awful way. And it was just like a throwaway line that it didn't really do anything with, and I was so confused about why that was even there, and that's all I keep thinking about when I think about this book now. So I don't know what that was about, but I didn't like it. Then lastly, we have Monstress Volume 9. So this is the 9th book in a graphic novel series that I have been really loving. I will admit, I didn't like Volume 8 quite as much, so I was very excited that Volume 9 seemed to be back to what I loved about the earlier volumes. The art is amazing. I love it so much. We're kind of just getting all these different factions involved in a war, but we have the humans and the witches kind of up against these ancient animal type gods, and then we have the Arcanics that are part human and part ancient, so they're like half animal people, and there's like all sorts of different animals. We also have the cats, who are necromancers, and the number of tails they have determines the amount of power they have. And the cats were doing some really interesting things in Volume 9, actually. I'm very excited to see more and more cats in this story. As well, we have the old gods. So at the start of this series, there are some old gods that kind of just hang like ghosts, like giant Cthulhu type ghosts above the city, and they'll just float around, but they're not really there. However, there is one old god that has a connection to our main character, Micah, and sometimes he'll kind of like come out and eat people, and it can be really horrific. And I feel like in Volume 9 we got back to a little bit more of the horror, a little bit more of learning about the mysteries of the world. And while like Volume 8 I finished it feeling a little bit let down by the series, Volume 9 has made me very excited for continuing the series. So if I'm battling these books against each other, firstly we'll take away Sour Candy because I didn't really like it. Then I kind of want to pick Monstress just because I enjoyed it so much, but part of me feels like I should pick What White People Do Next because I think as far as a non-fiction goes, that's probably, or like as far as anything goes, that's probably the book I would recommend the most, or like to the most people. It depends, like is this a battle about what I would recommend the most or about what I enjoyed the most? Best book of the month is open to interpretation, right? I guess that Monstress, even though I really loved it, I do think the plot could be doing a little bit more than it is. So let's pick What White People Can Do Next to go through to the next round. Oh, actually, that's going to go through the final, but let's do a couple of semi-final battles first. So we are going to have Nona the Ninth by Tamsyn Muir up against The Killing Moon by N.K. Jemisin. And I feel like this is going to start the trend that's going to continue in the final because, of course, I'm going to pick Nona. Actually, both of these books were kind of confusing, but The Killing Moon felt confusing by accident, whereas Nona was clearly confusing on purpose. And somehow that makes it better. So we're picking Nona to go through to the final. Then as well, we have Steel's Edge by Ilona Andrews up against Januaries by Olivie Blake. And I'm going to pick Steel's Edge mainly because short story anthologies are not my thing, or because I needed to read Januaries in a different way. I don't know, but whatever. I enjoyed my experience with Steel's Edge a lot better. So I'll put that through to the final, which means that the battle for the best book of the month is going to be Nona the Ninth by Tamsyn Muir up against Steel's Edge by Ilona Andrews, up against What White People Can Do Next by Emma Dabiri. And normally I try to take one away first, but anything I say now is just mucking around because the answer is Nona the Ninth. I loved it. It was such a strange experience, and I feel like you could almost make the argument that that book is badly written. Like, I can totally understand people reading that and not loving it, but also I am not surprised that a lot of people love it. It's so weird. It's so different. It's so amazing that it somehow takes everything that it is that could be terrible and then somehow makes it amazing. Honestly, I loved it. So that's the best book of the month. Let me know if you've read any of the books that I talked about on this video because I would love to chat with you about them down in the comments. Or let me know what the best thing was that you read in the month of February. Do subscribe if you'd like to see more of my bookish videos. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching. I hope that you are doing well, and I will see you next time.